India has re-elected Narendra Modi as Prime Minister.
His NDA bloc secured 293 seats, above the 200.
The Indian election is well and truly over. After putting together a coalition that dragged his National Democratic Alliance into power once again, Narendra Modi has begun his third term as Prime Minister of India. The path to victory wasn't easy in a campaign littered with missteps, misinformation, and allegations of complacency from the incumbent government. Despite clinging to power, Narendra Modi's BJP was punished by those lower down the ladder in India's intricate social caste system. Lower castes, millions of unemployed young people, and those worried that affirmative action protections in India's constitution might be removed, united against a ruling party accused of being too close to India's growing billionaire class. The message to Modi from the Indian people was that populist rhetoric has its limits. While nationalism can inspire voters, it remains to be seen whether it can sustain them when pressing issues like employment and economic security take centre stage. Modi didn't waste any time moving on from the election results. Just days after being sworn in, he was already in Italy attending the G7 summit. There, he reunited with his friend, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni.
As G7 leaders gather in southern Italy. Hello from the Melody team!
The friendship from Team Melodi is no surprise. Both have ascended to the pinnacle of their country's political system by appealing to right-wing populists. Both have fortified their base by targeting Muslims as outsiders in their society.
Io penso che ci sia un problema di compatibilità tra la cultura islamica o certa interpretazione.
But perhaps the strongest tie between Modi and his Italian counterpart is their goal of growing their own country's stature on the world stage. Under Modi's watch, India has become a regional power. It's been courted by Australia and the United States and has ramped up involvement in international affairs after decades as a non-aligned power. In Rome, Meloni holds a key role as a power broker in the delicately balanced European Union ecosystem. Following this month's EU elections, she's looking to exert her influence as the darling of the bloc's newly forged right-wing coalition.
It's a message that comes to us from Italians. Go ahead, go ahead. I take it as someone's message to say go ahead and do it, if possible, with greater determination.
Both Modi and Meloni are political opportunists, unlikely party leaders, and both have political histories that just a few years ago would have made their current roles on the world stage feel far-fetched and incompatible. But things have changed. The pair are part of a global shift, trending to the right of a political spectrum that is fast becoming futile in capturing how politics really works. So what does all this say about the communities that elect these leaders? And what impact will their recent electoral victories have ahead of a massive slate of elections closing out 2024? From the lands of the Kulin Nation, my name is Emma Hoy. This is Leave It to the Experts. As Narendra Modi confronts the reality of his new government, attention will turn to implementing his mandate. It initially looked like Modi would have to appease a new political coalition after his BJP failed to secure a parliamentary majority. The new India, it seemed, would be shaped by a BJP-led government forced to soften some of its sharper Hindu majoritarian edges. However, the core of Modi's cabinet will remain exactly the same.
So Modi 3.0 is officially underway. 71 ministers took oath today. 85% of them belong to the BJP, meaning the party has kept 60 out of 71 ministries.
The Prime Minister will be flanked by his political ally, Amit Shah, who remains as Minister of Home Affairs, and External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar will keep control of foreign policy. And so for the most part, answering the question, what comes next, is rendered far simpler. More of the same. After 10 years leading India, clear patterns have emerged in Modi's foreign policy. The self-styled, small-time party worker that characterised himself as an underdog has now climbed the ladder and sits amongst the world's most powerful actors in the global arena.
Most of the world's major financial institutions agree India is set to see significant economic growth in the coming years. He will propel India from the world's fifth largest economy to the third largest.
At the core of Modi's Hindu nationalist ideology lies an ambition to position India as a global leader. Last year, India hosted the G20 summit, bringing world leaders to Delhi to talk about defence strategy and technology. Its economy has boomed and it's made inroads in the space race.
It's been an historic day for India as it became the fourth country to land on the moon after a failed attempt.
It's joined the Quad security partnership with the United States, Australia and Japan to bolster regional stability and impede China's growing regional and global dominance. Modi's characterisation of India as a regional and global power is part of his electability at home. As India's economy expands, generating more wealth, considerations such as its global perception and geopolitical influence are gaining significance amongst Modi's constituents. A 2023 survey reported on by Foreign Policy found that 88% of respondents aged between 18 and 35 in India agreed it was important for India to secure a permanent seat on the UN Security Council.
Portuguese President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa has in fact said that he supports permanent membership of India and Brazil in the United Nations Security Council. He advocates...
Elon Musk has now put forth a statement. Remember, he's also the founder of India not having a permanent seat on the Security Council despite being the most populous country on earth is absurd.
A further 83% thought India should be a permanent part of the G7. But the nationalist confidence brought by the Modi regime also comes with a penchant for conflict and confrontation. Since the 2020 standoff at the border of the Galwan Valley, relations between India and China remain terse.
Now let's talk about the Indian Army, which is saying 20 of its soldiers have been killed by Chinese troops in the disputed Kashmir region. This is the first...
And in 2023, India was plunged into a diplomatic crisis with Canada, when its Prime Minister Justin Trudeau revealed what he called credible allegations that India was involved in the assassination of a Sikh separatist leader in Canada.
Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
Zooming out, a clear picture of Narendra Modi's foreign policy approach emerges, going hand in hand with his domestic political rise. Modi is a strong man. He portrays himself as someone who doesn't back down from a fight and a protector from pernicious forces, real or imagined. Despite the disappointing electoral results for Modi and the BJP, they still won the most seats. And as democracies around the world go to the polls in the second half of 2024, right-wing politicians might be hoping to bottle up some Modi magic of their own to win their votes. So how will the Modi government handle the political wins across the world? And what will the new Modi term look like to its rivals? Let's bring in our South Asia editor, Bharat Bhushan. Bharat, welcome back to Leave It to the Experts. Now, based on what we've seen in the first weeks of this new government, will the election results shape Modi differently in his third term, or is it business as usual?
Modi is desperate to give the impression that his government is in continuity, that this is a major victory and a heroic victory, because it's not often that a prime minister gets elected for the third time. But it is actually none of that. He's kept the same old people in his team, his national security advisor, his principal secretary, his key cabinet ministers are the same. So the impression is that nothing has changed. Yet the fact is, everything has changed. He has had to rely on coalition partners to even get a simple majority. Now, what that means demands that you listen to your coalition partners. And these coalition partners are pretty savvy politicians. They will demand their pound of flesh. They may not have demanded key portfolios in his government, but they will demand a lot of money for their states, which he will, because it's not his money, it's taxpayers' money that should be distributed. Modi will not be able to remake India in his distorted Hindu majoritarian vision, which means that the minorities in India can breathe slightly easily now under Modi 3.0.
So what impact is that message and that swing likely to have on the government's approach to big economic issues like, say, foreign investment, which has been notably down in recent years?
So Modi will be forced to focus on job creation and inflation. His party, the Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP, lost 1/3 of all the seats it contested in rural areas, which suggests that this was a reflection of the discontent in the countryside over lack of jobs and price rise. He'll also have to address the farm crisis. Farm incomes have been stagnant. And this is a major sign of widening gap in in incomes in rural and urban areas, and which has led to farmers' protests off and on, as we have seen in the past 5 years. He will present his budget for finance year 2024-25 in the third week of July. Economists think that he'll be forced to lower taxes, individual taxes, so that consumption can go up, because that has been a weak link in otherwise growing economy. Foreign direct investment during Modi's last 10 years had been rising for the first 8 years. It's in the last 2 years that it has started declining. I think what Modi will have to do is make the process of approval of foreign direct investment more efficient.
Moving now to the global stage, what are some of the key international issues facing Modi in his third term, and what do you think his major priorities are likely to be?
Modi has not changed his foreign minister. His foreign minister continues to be the same person, which is a signal that there will be a continuity in his foreign policy. He wanted to be seen as a statesman that world leaders listen to. And that's why he tried to project India as Vishwaguru or Guru to the world. Now, you can already see that he has substantially modified that, and now he describes India as friend of the world, Vishwabandhu, rather than a Guru. His challenge in the neighborhood will continue, especially to Pakistan, because Pakistan is an important neighbor. We need to engage with them. And Modi's failure in engaging with Pakistan is evident because he sees it only through the lens of terrorism. Another neighboring country I would like to mention is Myanmar, where India has tended to deal with the military junta, but now the military junta seems to be in retreat, so he needs to engage with the opposition democratic forces. As far as the West is concerned, Modi's engagement with the West has been transactional, and I think it will remain that. The Biden administration doesn't seem to like Prime Minister Modi very much, but cannot ignore India and values India. So US-India ties will continue to be driven by defense and cutting-edge technology cooperation. I don't see any change there. With Europe and UK, free trade agreements are due to be signed, and I think they will be signed. So transactional relationships with the West will continue. The China challenge will remain because this is the fifth year of border troubles with China, where China has grabbed about 1,000 square kilometers, or more than 1,000 square kilometers of land that is claimed by both sides in eastern Ladakh. India has been able to do nothing about it through any dialogue process, and war is out of the question. So Modi is stuck there. He in fact claims that nobody came and no land has been taken, etc., which is utter nonsense. So Modi's challenge will remain how to unlock the relationship with China and yet keep the US happy. Russia, I think a tightrope walk with Russia will continue. That relationship is determined really by our defense requirements and cheap oil now. And those two issues will remain there. Modi wants to contribute to the Ukraine peace process, but he has no plan except offering motherhood and apple pie statements saying that this is not the era of war. No, anybody can say that, but what do you do more than that? His influence on both Putin and Zelensky is limited, I think, to photo ops of the leaders hugging each other.
Coming back, though, to Modi's level of influence over politicians, specifically his style of political campaigning. In a recent interview, the French far-right leader Marine Le Pen listed Modi as a politician that she most admires. So, does that demonstrate influence? And where do you think this kinship that he seems to have forged with European far-right leaders has come from?
Well, the relationship with far-right organizations in Europe and in India is nothing new. You would be surprised to know that the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the National Volunteers Organization, as it calls itself, which is the mother organization of Modi's party, BJP, was set up by people who actually went and sought advice from Mussolini in the mid-1920s. And they wanted to see, just as he had militarized Italy, how could they learn from him to militarize Hindu society in India? So these links have existed historically. I think the kind of apartheid that Israel operates with, Modi would like to operate with that against Muslims in India. So they learn from each other. You would be surprised to know that this time when Modi did not get a simple majority and was not even the prime minister designate, Giorgia Meloni of Italy and the Israeli leader, they called him and congratulated him as if he was already the prime minister and helped him thwart any challenge, any putative challenge before it could even come up. So yes, there is a link. They admire each other. So they follow the same strategies. So is it any surprise that they admire each other and learn from each other?
Perhaps not. Bharat, wonderful. Pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Jaspin, and I'm the founding editor and director of 360 Info. At 360 Info, we're providing evidence-driven, solution-based journalism, all written by leading experts. Every week, we release new and innovative news content that bridges the gap between the world's brightest minds and the global public. To be part of the fight against misinformation, sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media, or head to 360info.org. If you're a journalist or a publisher or editor, you can sign up for our Newswire service, which is free of charge at newshub.360info.org.
To really understand Modi's influence and why India's rapid growth as a superpower matters so much, it's worth briefly retracing the backdrop to Modi's ascent to power. Modi's election in 2014 was the culmination of an era that ran for decades. After the Soviet Union fell in 1989, it gave way to a global marketplace that fueled and prioritised economic growth, no matter the cost. Throughout the 2000s, this growth was accelerated by the internet and all that came with digitisation. Concepts like freedom of movement and centralised currencies like the euro appeared to form the bedrock of our collective futures. But the single-minded pursuit of economic growth came at a substantial price. The 2008 global financial crisis tanked the world economy, particularly the US and Europe, hitting pause on this glorious shared future.
Another financial titan has fallen. The buyout comes as fears of a global financial collapse threaten some of the world's biggest financial institutions.
The European Union, which thrived on free-flowing money, and the United States, which dreamt up eye-watering wealth through its financial system, revealed a global issue. The rich were getting richer, and in a global market, if the company that employs you wants to save money, often there are people willing to do your job more cheaply. Nations like India originally benefited massively from this. The Indian economic miracle that we spoke of in episode 3 had a global impact. While car and tech companies flocked to South Asia for cheaper labour, they left a hole in the communities where they once existed in Europe and the United States. However, this money didn't flow directly to the Indian middle class. India's billionaire class has exploded in recent years, while, according to Nitin Bharti from NYU Abu Dhabi, India saw the wealth of its middle class get smaller.
10 years of his governance, there is definitely backsliding of the Indian development story. We are facing 45-year all-time unemployment. There is massive inflation. Then there is massive corruption charges now that are being alleged against him after the electoral bonds.
So, as people were struggling economically, social media filled a void, creating new spaces for people to voice their rage. Since the advent of social media, it's served as a double-edged sword for people searching for community. It's allowed the most marginalised people to find support, understanding and build relationships with like-minded people, no matter their isolation. It's also been a basis for radicalisation and indulging in some people's worst impulses. As more people found themselves out of a job and struggling financially, many sought refuge behind a keyboard. And for some, the chance to vent their frustrations through a cloak of unaccountable anonymity emboldened them, contributing to a toxic wave of racism, misogyny, and broader bigotry.
You've probably heard of 4chan and 8chan in the news, as places where internet Nazis thrive and mass shooters post their manifestos.
But for many others, the internet became a base of passive consumption, trawling social media, posting on forums, falling down YouTube rabbit holes ripe to be influenced by whoever reaches through their screen through paid advertising or recommendations from the algorithm. It also generated trillions of data points that businesses and politicians could use for their own benefit. One such politician who understood this very early on was Narendra Modi. Under Modi, the BJP has been a well-oiled digital propaganda machine, using platforms like WhatsApp to great political benefit. Cyberspace is also where Modi made the fastest inroads, setting the agenda for a global movement. According to Siva Vaidhyanathan from the University of Virginia, Modi laid the groundwork for names including Trump and later Maloney to leverage otherwise forgotten communities, their insecurities and their fears through social media to help create this current nativist trend that sparked a form of social revolution.
Around the world in 2024, we are going to see signs that democracy is healthy, and we're going to see signs that democracy is threatened. But again, we should divorce that question from the question of who wins which elections. Any sort of content that generates engagement, and engagement is driven by emotion, and emotion is most easily sparked if it's derisive, if it's fearful, if it's full of hatred. And so an authoritarian figure like Narendra Modi, an authoritarian figure like Rodrigo Duterte, right, or Marcos in his stead, Donald Trump in the United States, they are so willing to leverage the amplification power of these platforms. But that's not just leveraging the power of the algorithm, it's leveraging the social organization that occurs on these platforms by willing participants as well. And when Rodrigo Duterte ran the first time in 2016, he understood this intuitively, and his campaign knew. And I think it's pretty clear. Anybody who's looked at that election or Marcos's election more recently will concede that running an election on Facebook is best done if you're trying to frighten people, if you're trying to create dissension within society and seed mistrust. And that's always the first step to authoritarianism. So it's an interesting question to say, what if the world had no Facebook in 2015 and 16, or 14, 15, and 16, right? When Narendra Modi set the pattern for proto-authoritarian campaigns in weak democracies. Modi leveraged teams of trolls who would flood Facebook with messages that would harass critics, with messages that would rile up crowds, and indignation, mostly toward Muslims, but in some cases toward others. Modi leveraged Facebook rather brilliantly and taught other campaigns, other politicians, other movements around the world how to do it. When we assess the health of democracy, we have to look at the full picture. We have to look at the modes of resistance and the bubbles of resistance and the sense of potential, the sense of hope. And, fundamentally, so many of these governments that are illiberal or anti-democratic or authoritarian are uninterested in the long term. They're uninterested in saving the planet, saving the polar ice caps. And so we're, as a species, in this bizarre moment when the only way to save our standard of living, our ability to see a bright future for our children and grandchildren, is to fight for democracy so that we can address complicated long-term problems. Because authoritarianism offers no solution to complicated long-term problems. Authoritarianism and its appeal is all about the simple.
That was Siva Vaidhyanathan, Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia and the author of Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, speaking to 360 Info in 2023. With India's elections settled, the story now moves to Europe.
Now, in terms of this, what is a European Union results are for the European Parliament,
French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron and Narendra Modi seem to have little in common. Modi is in fact idolised by Macron's bitter rival, French far-right politician Marine Le Pen. But Modi and Macron do share one thing in common. They've had a bad month at the polls. Modi clung to power despite a swath of voters turning against him. Macron's parliament might not be so lucky. After a seismic European Union election in which more than 30% of French voters threw their support behind Jordan Bardella's right-wing National Rally Party, Macron dissolved the country's parliament, and called a snap legislative election.
President Emmanuel Macron has shocked France by announcing a snap parliamentary election after his alliance suffered a big defeat by the populist right in European Union elections.
In calling the vote, Macron called the attention to the danger of what he called nationalists and demagogues to France and the world at large. The election gives France a chance to check the pulse of the country's political landscape. If the rest of Europe is anything to go by, Macron's coalition of centrist parties may well be punished for not detecting the political wind change fast enough. Despite repeated close calls, the growing right-wing National Rally, formerly the National Front, could take power. Macron's gamble echoes David Cameron's call for a referendum on the European Union, which led to Brexit in 2016. Macron is now fighting the flames of a cultural fight at the heart of democracy, which might see him, as president, swear in France's first far-right prime minister since the Nazi invasion in 1940. What brought France here is being replicated across the globe. It's fundamentally reshaping the way democracies are being organised. The EU election saw a big win from the European People's Party. That centre-right party is set to take 184 of the 720 lawmakers in Parliament, the largest share of all parties. The centre-left Socialists and Democrats held firm on 135, but the Liberal Renew Europe party slid back 22 seats. The biggest advances were made by the far right. That national rally that won 1/3 of French voters back, it advocates to slash immigration, tighten border control and build deeper relationships with the Kremlin. The European Conservative and Reformists, helmed by Italian Prime Minister and friend to Modi, Giorgia Meloni, has 72 seats, and the Identity and Democracy Group, another right-wing group, vastly overperformed projections to snare a total of 58 seats in the EU chamber. The dust is still settling on why the European elections shook out so explosively. But there's a clear pattern in the parties who made the biggest strides. They're nationalist and they're anti-immigration. They believe in the strength of national identity and they catalyse their voter base by talk of protecting them from supposed enemies of the state. They are in many ways replicating a playbook that Narendra Modi has been writing since sweeping to power in 2014. And so when Giorgia Meloni takes selfies with the Indian Prime Minister and talks of Team Melodi, it's not just the usual niceties of diplomacy. It's two kindred political spirits who are riding the same wave to expand their influence globally. And they might just be getting started. To help us connect the dots, we have Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Monash University, Ben Wellings.
All right, Dr. Wellings, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, what do the recent EU election results tell us about just how powerful nationalism is as a political force today?
All right, so I think straight away we're into definitions because when we talk about nationalism, that can cover a range of different positions, and that can mean anything from centre right or centre left parties that take the nation state as an important framework for as a site of democratic activity, as it still is, or it can travel a spectrum through, if you like, a sort of radical right positions, which tends to frame their critiques of the existing system in nationalist terms, or even far right, which in some senses might underscore race rather than nation. And even on the far left of politics, we might find policies that accept a national community as a more legitimate political community than say international capital or big business. So when we talk about the position of nationalism, that's a little bit confused. If we focus it in, say, on the political gains, and I'm going to make a distinction between an electoral victory and a political gain in a minute, but the political gains in some important member states of the European Union, and I'm thinking here of Italy, Germany, but especially France, were made by parties that we would label as radical right populist parties. So basically, the picture from the EU elections is very mixed. And maybe I should say something for the listeners, Emma, about what the EU elections actually are and constitute. So the European Parliament is the world's largest supranational parliament in the world. There are 27 member states, so effectively there are 27 national contests. And the winners of those, the people who are elected members of the European Parliament, and then they don't sit in their national groups anymore, they sit in ideological groups. So there'll be a centre-left grouping, the centre-right grouping, a liberal grouping. But what we've seen, especially in the last two elections, they're every 5 years, in the last decade, is that support, but parties that are on outside of the centrist mainstream, if you like, have been gaining votes. So on the left, that's tending to go to the Greens, less so in this particular election. But on the right, it's been going to radical right parties, but also parties that we might consider just very conservative parties, right? And that is Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia. So this is a long way of explaining and answering your question, is to say that there is a certain growing level of support for radical right parties across the EU that tend to frame their critique of the European Union and domestic politics in terms of the nation and national values and national sovereignty. So and in some senses, Brexit was a little bit related to the same sentiment.
So when we talk about the rise of these radical right parties and the way that they deploy national identity as kind of a political tool, how does this modern globalization play into this sense of nationalism that we're seeing play out in different countries in the EU today?
Great question, right? So if we put it in that historical perspective, I think what's really important about nationalism today is that it's taking place within established states. So what we don't see in the kind of nationalism that we associate with Alternative for Germany, AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, and we don't see it in Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia, is any sense that they want to change the borders of Germany and Italy. And of course, in the 19th and 20th centuries, that was a major question. I think that where there are continuities, particularly in France, is with a republican conception of the nation. The French idea, a republican sense of national identity, is very, it's not like the kind of English-speaking multicultural ideas that there's this diversity and that can be accommodated with some loose sense of national values. What instead there is a very strong sense of, well, this is what France is about, and you adhere to it, and if you adhere to it, you are therefore French, right? And those values principally are what they call laïcité, secularism. And so interestingly, what we have now is a sort of a contest in France, if you like, it's like a contest between a kind of slightly more liberal version of French identity that Macron might embody, and then a much more secular version and stronger statements about more exclusive, actually, coming from Marine Le Pen. And so she draws on that Republican tradition that goes back to the French Revolution, where the idea is that division and disunity was death. But of course, at the time of the French Revolution, the French were being attacked by the Austrians and the British and the Russians, and everyone's trying to prevent that. Now the distinction is really about Islam. How we might distinguish a far-right party from a radical right party might relate to both their relationship to democracy, but also their relationship to Islam and Judaism. So far-right parties, which Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National came from, the Front National, which was set up by her father, who was a paratrooper in Algeria, the Algerian War in the 50s and 60s, which was at the moment at which also people from Algeria migrated to France or back to France if they were the so-called Pieds Noirs, the white settlers returning after independence. That they had direct kind of relationships with the sort of Vichy France era fascist regime, and were basically in that kind of fascist collaborationist mold, and they were anti-Semitic. And one of the things that Marine Le Pen has successfully done with Rassemblement National is disassociate the party with anti-Semitism, although that's contested, but nonetheless, that's the tactic has been, that's putting voters off. So they're not really just trying to appeal to a hardcore of really racist anti-democrats. They actually want to use democratic forums like the European Parliament elections or the French National Assembly elections to win seats and shape policy in the way that a sort of a normal party would.
And it's striking because it's certainly we're seeing this in Europe at the moment, but it's not an issue that is limited to Europe. For example, India's Narendra Modi and Italy's Giorgia Meloni recently met up at the G7 summit and were given the nickname Melody or Melody. And we also saw that France's Marine Le Pen had said that she idolizes Modi. So, what do these leaders from very different parts of the world that could theoretically come from very different political backgrounds, what do they have in common?
Yeah. Another great question, right? So, well, the point in common is that conception of nationhood again. So, the idea of nationhood sort of based on a sort of a more tightly drawn sense of inclusivity, and then hence a broader sense of exclusivity, if you like, with more people left out, is something that both Marine Le Pen, certainly Viktor Orban, the AfD in Germany, their visions of France, Germany, Hungary, for example, are very much focused on a sort of a Judeo-Christian values. And this is, I heard a recording of Trump endorsing Viktor Orban precisely for that, for defending Judeo-Christian values. Giorgia Meloni is a little bit kind of harder to pin down on this particular spectrum. Fratelli d'Italia, which really does have clear links to the post-war fascist movement, the residual fascist movement in Italy, but has similarly kind of presented itself as and is, in fact, like a party in the more modern mold. She sits in a group of sort of like very conservative parties. Marine Le Pen sits in the group of radical right parties, and the AfD in Germany and Viktor Orban are both like excluded from these parties for different reasons, because the AfD is sort of voicing more and more kind of pro-Nazi, over the sort of memory of the war and something. None of these political parties necessarily would see themselves as in the same ideological traditions quite, and they don't behave as if they do that.
So what does this trend that we're seeing towards right-wing nationalist leaders in Europe mean more broadly for democracy?
Well, it's dangerous for democracy. We've seen radical right parties do better to get themselves to a position where they influence centrist parties. What does it mean for democracy? It's not good for democracy because pretty much all of them, although I said that they endorse democracy, I think they like democracy when people vote for them. And I suspect that their commitment to voting as an element of democracy would start to weaken a bit as if fewer people started to vote for them. And so it's all about the legitimization that process can bring about. What we do see in places which have had radical right populists in government, Hungary, Poland, is what we call democratic backsliding. And I think this is the main risk here, is that in both those places, elements of what we would consider liberal, the institutions of liberal democracy, so free media, courts, independent courts, universities, have been slowly constricted or bent more towards the party. So it starts to look a little bit kind of like these sort of one-party states again in Eastern Europe. So that's the kind of like the strange thing about it from a historical perspective. So I think that if we had somewhere, say like France, where you had a radical right, a government or a coalition led by radical right and possibly even a radical right president in 2027, you'd probably see more of that kind of backsliding. But this being said, maybe the political culture in France is more robust than post-communist states. But nonetheless, I don't see. I mean, oftentimes, it's said, well, people vote for these parties, and that's okay, and of course they do, and that is the people's rights. But I think that the commitment to democracy is a little bit weak. Viktor Orban uses a term. He doesn't say he's a liberal Democrat. He's an illiberal Democrat. And the emphasis is more on illiberalism rather than democracy.
Dr. Ben Wellings, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Emma.
That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. Next time, we'll be back to see if Emmanuel Macron's grand gamble has paid off in France, as both the right and left extremes attempt to topple his centrist movement in the French Parliament. And in this year of democratic tests, we'll continue to analyse how the ripple effect of a nationalist, nativist movement across the world has its limits, as we look at the UK election and the predicted end of Rishi Sunak's prime ministership. Our in-depth coverage continues at 360info.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists and learn about our work with university experts worldwide to fight misinformation. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner, Reese Hooker and Lachlan Gaselli. Music by Jan Skubaszewski at Red Moon Studios. I'm your host, Emma Hoy. See you next time.